Chapter 11. Healing. The subject of healing has been elaborately treated by many writers, and fully deserves all the attention that has been given to it. But the object of these lectures is rather to ground the student in those general principles on which all conscious use of the creative power of thought is based, than to lay down formal rules for specific applications of it. I will therefore examine the broad examples which appear to be common to the various methods of mental healing which are in use, each of which derives its efficacy not from the peculiarity of the method, but from it being such a method as allows the higher laws of nature to come into play. Now the principle universally laid down by all mental healers is, whatever various terms they may explain it, is that the basis of all healing is a change in belief. The sequence from which this results is as follows. The subjective mind is the creative faculty within us, and creates whatever the objective mind impresses upon it. The objective mind, or intellect, impresses its thought upon it. The thought is the expression of the belief. Hence, whatever the subjective mind creates is the reproduction externally of our beliefs. Accordingly, our whole object is to change our beliefs, and we cannot do this without some solid ground of conviction of the falsity of our old beliefs and of the truth of our new ones. And this ground we found is the law of causation, which I have endeavored to explain. The wrong belief which externalizes as sickness is the belief that some secondary cause, which is really only a condition, is a primary cause. The knowledge of the law shows that there is only one primary cause, and this is the factor which is in our own individuality we call subjective or subconscious mind. For this reason, I have insisted on the difference between placing an idea in the subconscious mind, that is, on the plane of the absolute and without reference to time and space, and placing the same idea in the conscious intellectual mind, which only perceives things as related to time and space. Now, the only conception you can have of yourself in the absolute or unconditional is as purely living spirit, not hampered by conditions of any sort, and therefore not subject to illness. And when this idea is firmly impressed on the subconscious mind, it will externalize it. The reason why this process is not always successful at the first attempt is that all our life we have been holding the false belief in sickness as a substantial entity in itself, and thus being a primary cause, instead of being merely a negative condition resulting from the absence of a primary cause. And a belief which has been ingrained from childhood cannot be eradicated at a moment's notice. We often find, therefore, that for some time after a treatment there is an improvement in the patient's health, and then the old symptom returns. This is because the new belief in his own creative faculty has not yet had time to penetrate down to the innermost depths of the subconscious mind, but has only partially entered it. Each succeeding treatment strengthens the subconscious mind in its hold of the new belief, until at last a permanent cure is effected. This is the method of self-treatment based on the patient's own knowledge of the law of his being. But there is not in all men this knowledge, or at any rate not such a full recognition of it as will enable them to give successful treatment to themselves. And in these cases the intervention of the healer becomes necessary. The only difference between the healer and the patient is that the healer has learned how to control the less self-conscious modes of the spirit by the more self-conscious mode, while the patient has not yet attained to this knowledge. And what the healer does is to substitute his own objective or conscious mentality, which is will joined to intellect, for that of the patient, and in this way to find entrance into his subconscious mind and impress upon it the suggestion of perfect health. The question then arises, how can the healer substitute his own conscious mind for that of the patient? And the answer shows the practical application of those very abstract principles which I have laid down in the earlier sections. Our ordinary conceptions of ourselves is that of an individual personality which ends where another personality begins. In other words, that the two personalities are entirely separate. This is an error. There is no such hard and fast line of demarcation between personalities. And the boundaries between one and another can be increased or reduced in rigidity according to will. In fact, they may be temporarily removed so completely that, for the time being, the two personalities become merged into one. Now, the action which takes place between healer and patient depends on this principle. The patient is asked by the healer to put himself in a receptive mental attitude, which means that he is to exercise his volition for the purpose of removing the barrier of his own objective personality, and thus affording entrance to the mental power of the healer. On his side also, the healer does the same thing, only with this difference, that while the patient withdraws the barrier on his side with the intention of admitting a flowing in, the healer does so with the intention of allowing a flowing out. And thus, by the joint action of the two minds, the barriers of both personalities are removed, and the direction of the flow of volition is determined. That is to say, it flows from the healer as actively willing to give, towards the patient as passively willing to receive, according to the universal law of nature that the flow must always be from the plenum to the vacuum. The mutual removal of the external mental barrier between healer and patient is what is termed establishing a rapport between them. And here we find one of the most valuable practical applications of the principle laid down earlier in this book. The pure spirit is present in its entirety at every point simultaneously. It is for this reason that as soon as the healer realizes that the barriers of external personality between himself and his patient has been removed, he can then speak to the subconscious mind of the patient as though it were his own, for both being pure spirit, the thought and their identity makes them identical. And both are concentrated into a single entity at a single point upon which the conscious mind of the healer can be brought to bear, according to the universal principle of the control of the subjective mind by the objective mind through suggestion. It is for this reason I have insisted on a distinction between pure spirit, or spirit conceived of apart from extension in any matrix, and the conception of it as so extended. If we concentrate our mind upon the diseased condition of that patient, we are thinking of him as a separate personality, and are not fixing our mind upon the conception of him as pure spirit, which will afford us effectual entry into his spring of being. We must therefore withdraw our thoughts from the contemplation of symptoms, and indeed from his corporeal personality altogether, and must think of him as a purely spiritual individuality, and as such entirely free from subjugation to any conditions, and consequently as voluntarily externalizing the conditions most expressive of the vitality and intelligence which pure spirit is. Thinking of him thus, we then make mental affirmation that he shall build up outwardly the correspondence of that perfect vitality which he himself knows to be inwardly. And this suggestion, being impressed by the healer's conscious thought, while the patient's conscious thought is at the same time impressing the fact that he is receiving the active thought of the healer, the result is that the patient's subconscious mind becomes thoroughly imbued with the recognition of his own life-giving power, and according to the recognized law of subjective mentality, proceeds to work out of this suggestion into external manifestation, and thus health is substituted for sickness. It must be understood that the purpose of the process here described is to strengthen the subject's individuality, not to dominate it. To use it for domination is inversion, bringing its appropriate penalty to the operator. In this description, I have contemplated the case where the patient is consciously cooperating with the healer, and it is in order to obtain this cooperation that the mental healer usually makes a point of instructing the patient in a broad principle of mental science, if he is not already acquainted with him. But this is not always advisable or possible. Sometimes the statement of principles opposed to existing prejudices arouses opposition, and any active antagonism on the patient's part must tend to intensify the barrier of conscious personality, which it is the healer's first object to remove. In these cases, nothing is so effective as absent treatment. If the student has grasped all that has been said on the subject of spirit and matter, he will see that in mental treatment time and space count for nothing, because the whole action takes place on a plane where these conditions do not obtain, and it is therefore quite immaterial whether the patient be in the immediate presence of the healer or in a distant country. Under these circumstances, it is found by experience that one of the most effectual modes of mental healing is by treatment during sleep, because then the patient's whole system is naturally in a state of relaxation, which prevents him offering any conscious opposition to the treatment. And by the same rule, the healer also is able to treat even more effectively during his own sleep than while waking. Before going to sleep, he firmly impresses on his subjective mind that it is to convey curative suggestions to the subjective mind of the patient. And then, by the general principle of the relationship between subjective and objective mind, this suggestion is carried out during the all hours that the conscious individuality is wrapped in repose. This method is applicable to young children to whom the principles of the science cannot be explained, and also to persons at a distance. And indeed, the only advantage gained by the personal meeting of the patient and the healer is in the instruction that can be orally given, or when the patient is at the very early stage of knowledge, where the healer's visible presence conveys the suggestion that something is then being done which could not be done in his absence. Otherwise, the presence or absence of the patient are matters perfectly indifferent. The student must always recollect that the subconscious mind does not have to work through the intellect or conscious mind to produce its curative effects. It is part of the all-pervading creative force of nature, while the intellect is not creative but distributive. From mental healing, it is but a step to telepathy, clairvoyance, and other kindred manifestations of transcendental power, which are from time to time exhibited by the subjective entity, and which follow laws as accurate as those which govern that which we are accustomed to consider our more normal faculties. But these subjects do not properly fall within the scope of the book, whose purpose is to lay down the broad principles which underlie all spiritual phenomena. Until these are more clearly understood, the student cannot profitably attempt the detailed study of the more interior powers. For to do so without a firm foundation of knowledge and some experience in its practical application would only be to expose himself to unknown dangers, and would be contrary to the scientific principle that the advance in the unknown can only be made from the standpoint of the known. Otherwise, we only come into confused region of guesswork without any clearly defined principles for our guidance. End of chapter.